You spend years preparing for Everest. You learn to read the mountain like a language, wind patterns shifting across the ridge, clouds building just fast enough to matter, the subtle change in how your body responds to effort. You're told that experience is what keeps you alive up here. That judgment, more than strength, is what separates those who return from those who don't. And yet something strange keeps happening. Highly experienced climbers, people who know every rule, every warning sign, continue moving upward, even when those signs are clearly telling them to stop. Not because they don't see the danger, but because, at nearly 29,000 feet, danger doesn't announce itself loudly. It whispers, a slightly delayed step, a decision postponed by a few minutes, a small doubt quickly dismissed because the summit is so close it feels within reach. And in that narrow space between logic and desire, something begins to shift. On Everest, the greatest challenge isn't always the mountain. It's the human mind under pressure. Welcome to K2 Stories. There is a moment on Everest when the summit stops being an idea and becomes something measurable. Not distant, not abstract. You can see it. You can estimate how long it will take. You begin counting steps instead of hours. And once that shift happens, something subtle changes in the way decisions are made. Climbers often call it summit fever, but the term is misleading. It sounds emotional, impulsive, like a sudden loss of control. In reality, it's far more structured than that. It builds quietly, wrapping itself around logic rather than replacing it. Value. Because at that altitude, nothing feels random. Every thought feels justified. Every choice feels earned. You've spent years preparing for this, months training, weeks on the mountain. You've already endured the Khumbu icefall, the long rotations, the endless waiting for a weather window. Turning back now doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like erasing all of it. So the mind begins to negotiate. Just one more hour. Just a little higher. The wind doesn't feel that strong yet. The sky still looks stable. The forecast said conditions would worsen, but not immediately. There's still time. And time up here becomes a dangerous illusion. Because Everest rarely punishes decisions in the moment they are made. The cost comes later, often on the descent when energy is gone, when the weather finally shifts, when the margin for error disappears completely. But in the moment, continuing feels reasonable. That's what makes it dangerous. Near-miss accounts from Everest follow a pattern that is almost identical across different years, different teams, different conditions. A climber hears about worsening weather higher on the route, but interprets it as something temporary. A radio call mentions increasing wind speeds, but the air still feels calm where they are. Nothing looks urgent. So nothing feels urgent, and the summit continues to pull, not with force, but with gravity. Each step upward increases commitment, not just physically, but psychologically. Because turning around doesn't just mean going down. It means retracing every step you fought to gain. And the higher you go, the harder that becomes to accept. This is where judgment begins to shift. Not suddenly, but gradually. Danger is no longer processed as danger. It's reframed. Wind becomes discomfort. Fatigue becomes manageable. Delays become temporary. Even time limits clear, pre-planned turnaround times start to feel flexible. Because the summit is no longer far away. It's close enough to believe in. And belief at 29,000 feet can outweigh evidence. What makes this even more complex is that most climbers don't feel reckless when this happens. Before, often, is excuses. Calm, even. They tell themselves they've trained for this exact moment, that others turn back because they weren't prepared enough, weren't strong enough, didn't manage their climb properly. Experience, instead of protecting them, begins to reinforce the decision to continue. Because if you've done everything right, if you've followed every step, made every sacrifice, then this moment feels like something you've earned. But Everest doesn't operate on effort. It operates on conditions, on oxygen pressure, on wind speed, on time. And those variables don't adjust based on how close you are to the summit. They remain absolute, indifferent. In the end, what climbers call summit fever isn't about losing control. It's about holding onto control too tightly, trying to force certainty in an environment where certainty doesn't exist. It's hope under extreme constraint. Hope that the weather will hold. Hope that the body will keep functioning. Hope that this one moment after everything it took to get here will be the exception. And on Everest, hope can be just as dangerous as any storm. If summit fever is the engine, then cognitive bias is the fuel that keeps it running. Because once a climber makes a quiet internal decision, "I'm going to the top," the brain begins to filter reality in a very specific way. This is where confirmation bias takes hold. It's a simple mechanism. We favor information that supports our decision, and we downplay anything that challenges it. At sea level, this bias is manageable. At 8,000 meters, with limited oxygen and mounting fatigue, it becomes amplified. A brief lull in the wind suddenly feels like proof that the forecast was wrong. A manageable headache becomes evidence that your body is holding up. The absence of immediate danger is interpreted as safety. And slowly, almost invisibly, risk assessment begins to drift. What's striking is how often this pattern repeats across different expeditions. Climbers receive the same updates: deteriorating weather, narrowing summit windows, rising traffic on the route, and yet interpret them in completely different ways. Not because the data is unclear, but because the conclusion has already been chosen. In several recent seasons marked by higher-than-expected fatality rates, this exact dynamic played out again and again. Warnings were not ignored. They were absorbed, acknowledged, and then reinterpreted. The brain looks for exceptions. It recalls stories of climbers who summited in worse conditions. It remembers forecasts that turned out to be overly cautious. It searches for any evidence, no matter how small, that justifies continuing. And experience, surprisingly, can make this worse. Because experienced climbers have more memories to draw from, more examples where risk paid off, more confidence in their ability to adapt. Instead of protecting judgment, experience can sharpen the bias. Then there's the sunk cost fallacy. By the time a climber reaches the upper slopes of Everest, the investment is enormous. Not just financially, though expeditions can cost tens of thousands of dollars, but emotionally, physically, and psychologically. Months away from home, endless training, planning, and sacrifice. Turning back doesn't feel like a strategic decision. It feels like losing something that cannot be recovered. And that perception changes behavior. Because the mind begins to treat the summit as a way to justify everything that came before it. Without that final step, the effort feels incomplete, unresolved. So continuing upward starts to feel less like a choice and more like a necessity. Even when timelines have already been exceeded, even when small technical problems begin to appear, equipment issues, oxygen irregularities, delays on the route. Each of these on their own might not seem critical. But together, they narrow the margin for survival. The danger isn't a single catastrophic decision. It's the accumulation of small, reasonable ones. And what makes this especially dangerous is how these biases interact. Confirmation bias says, conditions are still acceptable. Sunk cost fallacy says, turning back is not an option. Together, they create a narrative where continuing feels like the only logical path forward. This is why statistics rarely change behavior on Everest. A season may see multiple incidents, Climbers may be fully aware of what has already happened on the mountain, but psychologically, they separate themselves from it. Those were different teams, different decisions. The human mind is remarkably good at believing that risk applies to others, not to us. But Everest is consistent in one critical way. The margin for survival decreases predictably, with altitude, with time, with fatigue. And the consequences of small decisions increase exponentially. 30 extra minutes near the summit, one delayed turnaround, one assumption that things will hold just a little longer. These are not dramatic choices. They don't feel like turning points. But on Everest, they often are. Because the price of continuing upward is rarely paid at the top. It's paid later on the descent. When the body is depleted, when conditions have shifted, when the same decisions that felt reasonable hours earlier can no longer be corrected. By then, the outcome has already been shaped, not by one mistake, but by a chain of decisions that at the time felt completely justified. By the time climbers enter the death zone above 26,000 feet, decision-making is no longer purely individual. Even when someone appears alone on the mountain, they are surrounded by something less visible, but just as powerful: social pressure. Not loud, not explicit. Among high-altitude climbers, there's an unspoken code. You don't complain. You don't hesitate publicly, and you don't turn back without a reason that feels undemocratic, not just to yourself, but to others. That standard is rarely written down, but it's understood quickly. It lives in the stories climbers tell, in who gets celebrated, and who quietly disappears from the narrative. In the subtle difference between being seen as resilient, or as someone who gave up too soon, and at extreme altitude where clarity is already compromised, that distinction starts to matter more than it should. Because humans are not built to make decisions in isolation. We look to others, especially in uncertain environments, for cues. If no one is turning back, stopping feels premature. This is social proof, and on Everest, it becomes a shortcut for judgment. In crowded seasons, this effect intensifies. Lines of climbers stretch along narrow ridges, movement slows, bottlenecks form. Time, already limited, begins to slip away. And yet, instead of triggering caution, the presence of so many people often has the opposite effect. It creates reassurance. So many climbers wouldn't be here if it were truly unsafe. But that assumption has proven wrong more than once. Because group momentum can replace individual assessment. Once a collective direction is established upward, it becomes difficult to break away from it. Not because climbers don't recognize the risk, but because stepping out of that flow requires a different kind of strength. The strength to act independently when everything around you suggests otherwise. And that's not easy, especially when identity is involved. Many climbers define themselves by endurance, by their ability to tolerate discomfort, to push further than others, to keep going when conditions deteriorate. Turning back challenges that identity. It raises uncomfortable questions. Am I stopping too early? Am I weaker than the others? Will this define me? These questions don't need clear answers to influence behavior. They operate quietly, shaping decisions from the background. And then there's visibility. Modern Everest expeditions are no longer isolated experiences. They're followed in real time through GPS trackers, social media updates, sponsor coverage. Supporters watch progress unfold from thousands of miles away. Summit success is visible. Turning back is often invisible, and that imbalance adds pressure. A visible absence from the summit. This doesn't make climbers reckless, but it does make hesitation more difficult. In several recent expeditions, especially those marked by rising incident rates, this dynamic became clear. Climbers continued upward even as conditions worsened, not because they felt strong, but because others appeared to be moving well. Doubt remained internal, and silence in these environments often becomes agreement. Once a team commits to continuing, breaking away feels like more than a personal decision. It feels like stepping outside the group, disrupting cohesion, abandoning shared momentum. So individuals stay aligned, even when their instincts suggest otherwise. What makes this particularly dangerous is that the mountain allows this pattern for a while. Progress continues. Nothing immediately goes wrong. The summit gets closer, so what goes the same, and that reinforces the decision. Until something shifts, not gradually, but suddenly. Wind speeds increase, temperatures drop, energy levels collapse faster than expected, and the margin that once felt manageable disappears. By the time someone decides to turn back, the context has changed. Not because the decision itself is wrong, but because it's late, too late to recover the lost margin. On Everest, the most dangerous thought is rarely spoken aloud. It's quiet and incredibly persuasive. Everyone else is still going. And by the time that thought is questioned, the window to act on it may already be gone. Above 26,000 feet, the body begins to fail in ways that are difficult to recognize in real time. Not dramatically, not all at once. Quietly, at that altitude, even with supplemental oxygen, the brain is operating under hypoxia, a reduced level of oxygen that directly affects cognition. Reaction times slow, focus narrows, complex decisions become harder to process. So the mind adapts. It simplifies. Instead of evaluating new information continuously, it defaults to the easiest option. Continue doing what you were already doing. This isn't stubbornness, it's physiology. And one of the most dangerous effects of hypoxia is that it doesn't feel like impairment. Climbers often describe a sense of calm, even confidence, as if everything is under control, while objectively, their ability to assess risk is declining. This creates a powerful illusion. Because self-assessment becomes unreliable, a climber may believe they are thinking clearly while missing obvious warning signs. Small problems, things that would be immediately corrected at lower altitude, can go unnoticed or be dismissed as minor inconveniences. An oxygen system that isn't functioning properly, a glove that's not fully secured, a rope that's been misrouted. Individually, these are manageable. But at extreme altitude, they compound quickly. Then there are the early symptoms of altitude-related conditions: headache, fatigue, shortness of breath, mild confusion.
All of these can feel normal.
Expected even, so they are often ignored. In post-incident analyses from recent Everest seasons, these signs were present hours before critical situations developed, but in the moment, they didn't stand out. They blended into the background of discomfort that climbers have trained themselves to endure. Another factor that's rarely discussed openly is perceptual distortion. At extreme altitude, climbers have reported hearing sounds that aren't there, seeing figures or movement that doesn't align with reality, or feeling a sense of companionship when they are physically alone. These experiences are not always alarming. In fact, they can feel reassuring. They reduce urgency. They make the environment feel less hostile than it actually is. And that can delay critical decisions, especially the decision to descend. It requires recognizing that the situation is deteriorating and that immediate action is necessary. But hypoxia works against that recognition. It stretches time. The summit appears closer than it is. The descent feels like something that can be handled later. But later arrives quickly, and often under worse conditions. In several recent cases, climbers reached or came very close to the summit, only to encounter serious difficulty on the way down. Not because something dramatic happened at the top, but because the body had already been pushed beyond its functional limits. Energy reserves were gone. Cognitive function was reduced. And once the descent began, there was no capacity left to adapt. Rescuers in these situations often find climbers who are conscious but unable to move effectively, not due to a single failure, but due to cumulative exhaustion and impaired decision-making that began hours earlier. This is what makes the death zone so deceptive. It doesn't force immediate outcomes. It reduces options gradually, until the point where no good choices remain. By the time danger becomes obvious, the ability to respond has already been compromised. And this is why experience alone is not enough, because the body does not adjust its limits based on how many expeditions you've completed. It responds to altitude, to time spent under stress. At 8,000 meters, physiology overrides intention. You cannot think your way out of hypoxia. You cannot will your body to recover in an environment that is actively working against it. The mountain doesn't need to overpower you. It only needs you to believe, just a little longer, that everything is still manageable, that you're still in control. When people look back on Everest incidents, they often focus on the final moments. A delayed turnaround, a Christian 12, a nastic, a shift in weather, an equipment failure, but those are endpoints. The real story begins much earlier, shaped by decisions that felt small, reasonable, and completely justified at the time. That's what makes Everest different. It doesn't demand reckless behavior. It tests something far more difficult: restraint. The ability to walk away when everything inside you says to keep going. To accept an unfinished outcome. To trade a summit for a return. Because the mountain doesn't measure effort. It doesn't reward how close you came. It doesn't remember your preparation, your sacrifice, or your intent. Only one thing defines the outcome. Whether you come back again and again, survival on Everest has belonged not to the strongest or the fastest, but to those who recognize the moment when continuing stops being a calculated risk and becomes a commitment they can't reverse. That moment is rarely obvious. It doesn't announce itself. It appears quietly hidden inside decisions that feel logical. And that's the lesson. Better forecasts will help. Stronger equipment will help. More regulation may reduce some risk. But none of these replace the single decision that matters most. The decision to turn back in time. Because in the end, the summit is just a point. A place you stand briefly, if at all. But the descent, that's the real climb. That's where outcomes are decided. And that's where judgment matters most. Everest, K2, reaching the summit is optional. Coming back alive is not. If stories like this matter to you, if understanding how thin the line is between control and consequence matters, then this is what K2 Stories is here for. Quiet lessons from the highest places on Earth. Thank you for watching it within the best one for the Mountaineering. And I'll see you in the next story.